Jake Morrison stood on the landing platform at New Haven Station and watched the sky turn silver above him and the strange ship descended through the clouds. It's like liquid metal flowing downward, and it made no sound at all, and that was the part that scared him most, because everything made sound when it moved through air, but this vessel just glided down smooth and silent and impossible. And Jake had been a soldier for 15 years, and he had seen many strange things, but nothing like this. The ship settled onto the concrete platform with barely a whisper, and Jake gripped his coffee mug tighter and waited beside the other soldiers and officers who had been called to witness this arrival. And Commander Lisa Hayes stood at the front of the group with her hand near her weapon, and everyone was tense because the sensors had been screaming warnings since the ship first appeared. Then the side of the vessel opened, and she walked out, and Jake forgot how to breathe. She was tall, and her skin shimmered between pale white and soft purple, and her ears swept back in elegant points, and her eyes were violet and gold and swirling like nebulae. And behind her came something that made the soldiers take a step back, and it was massive and covered in black scales that caught the light like obsidian glass. And Jake knew he was looking at a dragon, and it was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever seen. An alien woman swept her gaze across all the assembled humans, and then, without warning, she raised one long, elegant finger and pointed directly at Jake Morrison, and she spoke in perfect English, and her voice was clear and strong. "That is my husband," she said, and the words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Jake dropped his coffee mug, and it shattered on the concrete, and hot liquid splashed across his boots, and he stared at her. His mouth opened, but no words came out, because what could he possibly say to that? Commander Hayes stepped forward quickly, and her voice was professional, but Jake could hear the tension underneath him. "I think there has been some mistake, and Lieutenant Commander Morrison has never left Earth, and he could not possibly know." Youth alien woman looked at the commander, and her expression was patient but firm. "There is no mistake, and I am Crown Princess Lyria of the Silver Moon Dominion, and this is Ashker, my bonded guardian, and that man is my betrothed. And we are bound by ancient compact and prophecy, and our wedding was arranged before your species even discovered." Fire Jake finally found his voice, and it came out higher than he would have liked. "I'm sorry, Your Highness, but I have definitely never been engaged to an alien princess, and I think I would remember." That Princess Lyria looked at him, and something in her expression softened, and it might have been sympathy or sadness or both. "Would not remember, and not yet, but the war is coming, Jake Morrison, and our union is the only thing that stands between your world and destruction, and the Void Swarm has already consumed 17 star systems, and Earth is next on their path." The dragon Ashkir lifted his massive head and released a low call that Jake felt in his bones, and it resonated through his chest and made his teeth ache. And in the distance, alarms began to sound as the deep space sensors picked up something emerging from the darkness between stars, and it was vast, and it was hungry, and it was headed toward Earth. Lyria extended her hand toward Jake, and her fingers were long and graceful. "We have 3 months to stop them, and 3 months to remember who we were and who we are and who we must become. And will you stand with me, Jake Morrison, or will you let your world burn while you cling to a life you were never meant to live?" Jake looked at her offered hand, and then at the dragon, whose amber eyes held ancient wisdom, and then at the darkening sky, where something wrong was beginning to appear at the edge of his vision. And he thought about his quiet life, and his simple plans, and the ordinary future he had imagined, and then he thought about Earth, and about humanity, and about billions of lives that might end if he walked away. He reached out and took her hand. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded into white light, and Jake felt his mind torn open, and memories flooded through him like a dam breaking, and he saw battles fought across dimensions, and a love that spanned lifetimes and promises made beneath dying stars. And he saw himself as he had been in another existence, standing beside Lyria as they faced down horrors that defied description. And he saw their first meeting and their first kiss, and the moment they had made their vow to protect the innocent no matter what it cost them. And he saw the void swarm, and it was an endless tide of chittering darkness that consumed everything in its path and left nothing but empty space behind. and it was hunger given form and malevolence. Made real, and Jake understood in that moment why Lyria had crossed the stars to find him. When the light faded, Jake was on his knees and gasping for air, and his hands were shaking, and Lyria knelt beside him with her hand still holding his and her. Eyes were full of understanding and sorrow. "Now you remember," she whispered, and her voice was gentle, "and now we begin." Shakir spread his wings, and they were enormous, and they blocked out the sun for a moment, and the dragon looked down at Jake with those ancient eyes. "The war for Earth has begun, young one, and you are no longer just a soldier, and you are a guardian and a bridge between worlds, and you carry the memories of 1,000 battles, and now you must choose whether to run from your destiny or embrace it." Jake looked up at the dragon, and then at Lyria, and then at his own hands, which were still shaking, and he could feel the weight of those recovered memories pressing down on him. And they were not complete yet, but they were enough to understand what was at stake. Commander Hayes was shouting orders, and medical teams were rushing forward, and the other soldiers were backing away from the alien princess and her dragon, but Jake barely noticed any of it, because his entire world had just been turned upside down. Lyria helped him to his feet, and she was surprisingly strong for how slender she looked. "High. No, this is overwhelming, and I know you have questions, and we will answer them all, but right now, we need to move you somewhere safe, and the memories will continue to surface over the next few days, and it will be painful and confusing, but I will be with you through all of it." Jake nodded because he could not trust himself to speak, and Lyria guided him toward the waiting transport, and Ashkir followed behind them, and his massive form cast shadows across the landing.
Platform-ass.
They walked. Jake caught glimpses of the other soldiers staring at him, and some looked afraid, and some looked angry, and some just looked confused, and he understood all of those emotions because he felt them too, and his life had just been completely shattered and rebuilt in the span of seconds. Inside the transport, Lyria sat beside him, and she did not let go of his hand, and Jake was grateful for that anchor because everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. The dragon Oscar could not fit inside the transport, so he launched himself into the air and flew alongside them, and Jake watched through the window. As the massive creature moved with impossible grace, "Your people will have many questions," Lyria said quietly, "and they will want to know if I am a threat, and they will want to study me and Ashkir, and they will want proof of everything I have told them, and we will provide that proof, but Jake, you must understand that time is not on our side, and the swarm does not wait, and every day we delay is another day closer to extinction." Jake turned to look at her and really look at her, and he could see now that she was tired, and there were lines of strain around her eyes, and she had been carrying this burden for a long time. "How many times have we done this?" he asked, and his voice was rough. "And how many times have we tried to stop the swarm?" Lyria met his gaze, and her expression was solemn. 7 times, across 7 different lifetimes, and sometimes we won, and sometimes we lost. But each time, we bought the innocent more time to prepare, and each time we learned more about how to fight them. And this time, Jake Morrison, this time we have a chance to end it permanently." Transport descended toward a secure facility beneath the station, and Jake could see armed guards waiting at the entrance, and he knew his life would never be simple again, and that quiet retirement he had been planning was gone forever. But as he looked at Lyria and felt the weight of those recovered memories, he realized that maybe that simple life had never been his true destiny after all. The first week after Lyria arrived felt like living in a dream that Jake could not wake from, and the memories kept coming in waves, and each one hit him like a physical blow, and he would be standing in the training room and suddenly remember a battle on a planet with 3 suns, or he would be eating breakfast and recall the taste of fruit from a world that no longer existed because the swarm had devoured it. Lyria stayed with him through all of it, and she was patient and kind, and she never pushed him to remember faster than his mind could handle, and sometimes she would just sit beside him in silence and hold his hand while the memories sorted themselves out. They worked in a secured facility deep beneath New Haven Station, and the military had assigned them a whole level for training and preparation, and Ashkir barely fit through the corridors, but the dragon seemed amused by the tight spaces, and he would make comments about how humans built everything so small. Amy Bennett was the chief engineer at the station, and she had taken an immediate interest in Ashkir, and the dragon seemed to like her too, which surprised everyone, and Amy would scratch beneath his jaw while discussing quantum mechanics with Lyria. And Ashkir would rumble with contentment like an enormous cat. The facility had holographic displays everywhere, and Lyria used them to show Jake what they were facing, and the images made his blood run cold, because the Void Swarm was not like any enemy humanity had ever encountered. They do not just destroy Lyria, explained during one of their sessions, and her voice was grim. And they consume, and every atom, and every molecule, and every trace of energy gets absorbed, and they leave nothing but darkness in their wake, and entire star systems just vanish, as if they never existed. Jake studied the tactical data in his military training, fought with the otherworldly knowledge, slowly awakening in his mind. Why us, and why Earth, he asked. Because humanity is special, Lyria said, and there was wonder in her expression. And your species should not exist, Jake, and you evolved on a world that, by all logic, should be barren, and you achieved consciousness against impossible odds, and you reached for the stars despite every setback, and the Void Swarm fears that resilience, and they want to destroy it before it spreads across the galaxy. And our connection, Jake gestured between them, and the betrothal Lyria moved closer, and her presence was commanding yet gentle. In my people's ancient past, we discovered that certain souls resonate across dimensions. When do such souls bond, they create a harmonic that can channel forces beyond normal understanding, and you and I are such a pair, Jake, and together we can do what neither could alone, and we can stand against the Swarmishker. Rumbled agreement from his corner, where Amy was explaining human coffee to him, and the dragon seemed fascinated by everything about Earth, despite being ancient beyond measure. That night, Lyria took Jake to the surface, where the stars blazed overhead, and she pressed her palm to his chest over his heart and whispered words in her native tongue, and the world shifted around them. Suddenly, Jake could see things he had never seen before, and there were threads connecting everything, and quantum entanglements and probability, waves and fundamental forces that held reality together, and he could see the tears in that fabric, and the places where the Void Swarm was already beginning to press through from their dimension into normal space. "We are running out of time," he breathed. "Yes, Lyria agreed," and her voice was quiet, "and the first scouts will arrive in 6 weeks, and we need to be ready." Training that followed was intense, and Jake discovered abilities he never imagined, and he could manipulate gravitational fields and create shields of pure force and sense danger before it arrived, and more than that, he learned to work in perfect synchronicity with Lyria, and when they fought together in simulations, they moved as one being, and each anticipated the other's actions with preternatural precision. Ashkur trained them both in the ancient combat forms of his people, and they were aerial maneuvers that seemed impossible until Jake found himself flying alongside the dragon and supported by Lyria's telekinetic embrace, and the feeling of soaring through the air with them was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. "You fight well together," Ashkir observed, after one particularly intense session, and his voice was deep and resonant. "But you still hold back human, and you fear what you are becoming." Jake could not deny it, because with each passing day, he felt less like the simple soldier he had been, and more like something else, and it was vast and ancient and powerful, and it should have terrified him, but instead it felt like coming home. "I am not holding back," he protested. "The dragon's laugh was like rolling thunder. You keep your heart closed, and Lyria has given you hers completely, as she did in your previous lives, and yet you treat this as a mission and not a marriage." That night, Jake found Lyria standing at the edge of the base and watching the stars, and he joined her in silence while he gathered his thoughts. "I remember loving you," he said finally, "and in those other lives and in those other times, but those were not really me and not the person I am now, and I am just Jake Morrison from Portland, and I fix starship engines and drink too much coffee and worry about my retirement plan, and how can I be what you need me to?" Valeria turned to him, and her smile was sad and understanding. "You are not just anything, Jake, and that man from Portland, with his kindness and his humor and his stubborn determination, is exactly who I fell in love with across time and space, and I do not need you to become someone else, and I need you to be you and the man who took my hand, even when he did not remember. Why it mattered? She placed her hand over his heart again. The power awakening in you was always there. The connection we share is as real as anything in this universe. And whether you call it prophecy or quantum entanglement or fate, it exists. And yes, we have a war to fight, but Jake, we also have a life to live. And do not lose yourself in preparation for battle, Jake. Pulled her close and felt the rightness of it, and the way they fit together as if the universe itself had designed them. For each other I am scared, he admitted, and not of the swarm, but of failing you and of failing Earth then. We will face that fear together, Lyria whispered, and as we always have Ishkers. Roar split the night, and it was a warning, and in the sky above. Then reality rippled and twisted, and something was tearing through the fabric of space, and the first scouts were arriving ahead of schedule. Jake felt his newly awakened powers surge to life, and Lyria's hand found his, and their energies began to intertwine, and Ashkir spread his wings and launched himself into the air. The war they had been preparing for had just begun, and there was no more time for doubt or fear, and Jake Morrison looked up at the tier in reality and felt something shift. Inside him, and the memories of 7 lifetimes crystallized into certainty, and he knew exactly what he needed to. Delaria squeezed his hand, and together they rose into the air, and following Ashkir toward the approaching darkness, and below them. Alarms began to sound across the entire station, and the military scrambled to respond, but Jake and Lyria and Ashkir were already engaging the enemy. Void Scout that emerged from the dimensional rift was like nothing Jake had ever seen, and it flickered between states of matter and phased in and out of normal space, and it radiated hunger and malevolence. But Jake was not the simple soldier anymore, and Lyria was beside him, and Ashkir roared his challenge, and together the 3 of them met the scout head-on, and the battle lit up the night sky like a second sun being born. The Void Swarm's scout tore through the atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean, and it was not really a ship in any normal sense, but more like hunger given physical form, and it kept shifting between solid and not solid, and flickering in and out of reality. And Jake could feel wrongness radiating from it, like heat from a fire. He stood in space above Earth, with Lyria beside him, and Ashkir circling them both, and Jake realized he was breathing vacuum without any protection, and it should have killed him, but the powers awakening inside him were keeping him alive, and it felt natural now instead of strange. The scout is testing our defenses, Lyria said, and her voice came through their mental link instead of sound, and it wants to see if we are worth bringing the full swarm. Then let us disappoint it. Jake replied, and his voice was hard. Admiral Karen Walsh was commanding from the warship, Valiant far below them, and her voice crackled through the communication system. Morrison, we are reading massive energy spikes from your location, and whatever you are planning, you have 5 minutes before I send in everything we have trust, as Jake said, in knowing he should show more respect, but feeling urgency pressing down, and Lyria and I will handle the scout and keep your ships back, because these things feed on conventional weapons. He could hear the Admiral hesitate, but she had survived first contact with 6 different alien species by knowing when to trust her. Pepelu of 5 minutes, she said, and then I am sending in the fleet. Jake nodded to Lyria, who turned to Ware. Ashkir waited, and the dragon had grown since arriving on Earth, or perhaps he had just stopped hiding his true size, and he was massive now and easily as long as 3 football fields, and his scales reflected starlight. Tready, old friend? Lyria asked in her native language. Ishkir responded by launching himself at the scout, and his wings spread wide to catch solar wind, and Lyria stepped off into space. After him, and her form surrounded by silver and violet light, and Jake followed, and trusting the power inside him to keep him alive in the void, they moved as one toward the Void Scout, and Jake felt the rightness of their formation, and princess, and warrior, and dragon, and working in perfect harmony, and the Scout sensed them coming and turned its attention fully toward them. Reality warped as it attacked, and probability itself became weaponized, and timelines split and merged, and possible futures became immediate threats, and Jake saw himself dying 1,000 different ways in 1,000 different moments. But he and Lyria had fought in spaces between dimensions before, and they moved through the chaos with practiced grace, and their bond allowed them to anchor each other to a single timeline, and Ashker's roar tore through the probability storm, and his voice carried harmonics that stabilized. Local spacetime now, Lyria called through their link. Jake and Lyria's hands met, and power erupted between them, and it was not magic exactly, but more like fundamental manipulation of quantum states, and they forced the scout to exist in a single configuration, and the entity screamed, and the sound existed across multiple frequencies. And it tried to flee back into its between. Space-ish cur was there first, and the dragon's jaws closed around the scout. And not physically, but dimensionally, and Jake watched in awe as the ancient creature literally devoured the invader's connection to its home dimension, and severing it from the greater swarm consciousness, the scout thrashed and weakened. But still deadly, and it lashed out with tentacles of compressed darkness, and one caught Jake across the chest, and pain exploded through him, and it was not physical pain but something deeper, and as if the attack tried to erase him from causality, Sylphlaria screamed, and her voice was pure rage, and her power flared brighter than Jake had ever seen, and she threw herself between him and the scout, and light met darkness in a collision that sent shockwaves rippling through space, and satellites kilometers away flickered and died from the energy. Overflowed. Jake, listen to me. Lyria's voice cut through the pain in his mind, and remember the binding ritual, and remember what we did at the Battle of Crimson Nebuland. Suddenly he did remember, and it was a technique so dangerous they had sworn never to use it again, and the complete merger of their consciousnesses and becoming temporarily a single entity with exponentially greater power, and they had nearly lost themselves last time, and unable to separate their thoughts and identities, and it had taken centuries to recover. But Earth did not have centuries due, Jake sent back through their link, and I trust you. Their hands met again, but this time it did not just channel power through their bond, and instead they became the bond itself, and Jake felt his sense of self dissolve and reform and merged with Lyria's ancient wisdom and fierce protective love, and through her eyes he saw himself as she did, and brave and foolish and beautiful and stubborn and kind and absolutely irreplaceable. Through his eyes she saw herself reflected and powerful and lonely and determined and carrying burdens no one should bear alone. Together they were so much more than the sum of their parts. The merged entity that was Jake and Lyria reached out with hands of pure force and tore the Void Scout apart at the molecular level, and they did not just destroy it, but unraveled its very existence, and following its quantum signature back through dimensional barriers and scorching shut the pathway it had used to reach Earth. Then they turned their attention outward too, where the greater swarm lurked beyond the edge of the solar system, and the entity spoke, and its voice carried across light years. We stand here, and we will not yield, and come if you dare, but know that Earth is defended. The swarm's response was a wave of pure malevolence that promised extinction and death and consumption, but for the first time in eons, it also contained something else. And Jake felt it clearly. Hesitation. The swarm was afraid. The merged entity began to collapse and separating back into distinct individuals, and Jake and Lyria fell and caught by Ashker's gentle telekinetic embrace and carried back to the Valiant, and by the time they reached the hangar both were unconscious but alive, and their hands were still clasped. Together Admiral Walsh met them as medical teams rushed forward, and her face was pale. What in seven hells was that? And every sensor on the planet just picked up some kind of declaration on. Bennett looked up from her science station, and her eyes were wide. It was not a declaration of war, Admiral, and it was a line in the sand, and the swarm just blinked in the medical bay. Jake and Lyria lay side by side and still holding hands, and their vital signs were stable, but the medical scanners showed something strange, and their heartbeats had synchronized perfectly in beating. As Onishker curled himself around the medical bay, and his massive form barely fitting in the space, and he watched over them with ancient, patient eyes, the boy and the princess performed well, the dragon said to Amy, who had stayed behind when the others left, and they had bought Earth time, but the swarm will not forget this challenge, and they will come prepared next time. How long do we have, Amy Skiers? Eyes glowed amber in the dim light. 3 weeks, perhaps 4, and they will not send scouts again, and they will send the swarm itself in millions of entities. Hungry for revenge, and Earth must prepare. Me looked at Jake and Lyria lying unconscious. And still joined by their clasped hands, will they be ready? The dragon rumbled deep in his chest. They will have to be, and the fate of your species depends on its outside. The medical bay Earth spun peacefully in the void and unaware of how close it had come to extinction, and the stars shone cold and distant, and between them something vast and hungry began to move. The void swarm had been challenged, and now it was coming in force, and Earth had 3 weeks to prepare for war, and 3 weeks to unite or fall, and 3 weeks to prove that humanity deserved its place among the stars. Jake stirred in his sleep, and his dreams were filled with battles yet to come, and Lyria's presence in his mind was warm and reassuring, and together they rested and gathering strength for the fight ahead. The war for Earth had truly begun. Jake woke 3 days later to the sound of wings, and at first he thought he was dreaming, but then he realized it was. Ashkir gently fanning air through the medical bay to keep them cool, and Lyria lay beside him still unconscious, and their hands remained locked together as if they could not bear to separate. How long, he croaked, and his throat was dry. 3 days, Amy, Bennett replied, and looking up from her tablet, and she had barely left their side, according to the medical staff, and you gave us quite a scare because your neural patterns kept merging and separating, and we were not sure you would come back as individuals. Jake squeezed Lyria's hand, and her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he could still feel the echo of their merger, and her thoughts dancing at the edge of his awareness, and his emotions reflected in her consciousness, and then the boundaries solidified. And they were two again, though forever changed. That was stupid, Ashkir rumbled from his corner, and also necessary. But still very stupid. Did it work? Lyria asked, and her voice was weakening. Activated a holographic display, and her expression turned grim. See for yourself. The display showed the solar system's edge, where space itself seemed to boil with approaching darkness, and the void swarm was not sending scouts anymore, and they were coming in force, and thousands upon thousands of entities moving toward Earthida. Jake asked, already doing calculations with the tactical knowledge from his recovered memories. 18 days to Jupiter's orbit, and 21 days to Earth, assuming they do not accelerate, Amy said, and pulled up more data. But here's the interesting part, and they are not moving as fast as they could, and it is like they are being cautious because they've never encountered resistance before, Lyria said, and sitting up despite the protests from the medical team, and the swarm has consumed thousands of worlds and millions of species, and all of them fell quickly and overwhelmed by sheer numbers and dimensional attacks, but we hurt them, and that scout was not just destroyed but erased so completely that the swarm lost all the data it had gathered. They were afraid, Jake realized, and the thought was both empowering and terrifying. Fear makes them more dangerous, Ashkir warned, and a cornered predator fights hardest, and they will come prepared this time. Next 2 weeks passed in a blur, and the display of power against the scout had galvanized Earth's nations like nothing before, and old rivalries were set aside as humanity united against the common threat in manufacturing facilities worldwide, churned out weapons designed from Lyria's knowledge in gravity cannons and dimensional shields and quantum mines. But the real key to Earth's defense lay in something unexpected, and Lyria discovered that humans possessed a latent ability her people had never encountered, in an almost unconscious manipulation of probability fields, and it was why humanity had survived so many near extinctions, and why they had beaten impossible odds throughout their history. And on an individual level, it was barely noticeable. But if millions of humans focus their intent together, we call it the Resonance Project, General Tom Hayes explained during a briefing, and he had taken command of Earth's defense forces, and every major population center has been equipped with amplification nodes, and when the attack comes, if we can get enough people focusing on Earth's survival simultaneously, might tip the scales, Lyria finished, and her expression was thoughtful, but it is risky, because if the swarm realizes what we are doing, they will target the population centers first. They will target them anyway, Jake said grimly, and the swarm does not take prisoners, and everyone fights or everyone dies, and at least this way, people are not helpless the night before the swarm arrived. Jake found himself on the observation deck watching Earth rotate peacefully below, and Lyria joined him as she always did, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "I am not afraid of dying," Jake said quietly, "and not anymore because I remember enough lifetimes to know it is not the end, but I am afraid of failing and of watching Earth become another empty system on their Lysileria." Took his hand and squeezed gently in all those lifetimes and across all those battles. "I have learned one truth, and we do not always win, and sometimes we fall, and sometimes worlds burn despite our best efforts, but we never stop fighting, Jake, because every stand we make, and every time we force the darkness to bleed for its victories, we buy time for others to prepare, and we inspire resistance across the cosmos. That is not very comforting," Jake said, but smiled. Despite himself, no, Lyria agreed, "but it is true, and here is another truth. And in all those lifetimes, I have never fought beside anyone who made me believe in victory the way you do, and your species' stubborn refusal to accept the impossible, and your ability to find hope in the darkest moments, and that is why the prophecy pointed here. And that is why Earth matters." She pulled him close, and their kiss was neither duty nor destiny, but simple, profound choice, and they stood together watching the stars until Ashkir's low warning growl brought them back to the present. Darkness had arrived. The void swarm erupted into the solar system like a disease spreading in thousands of entities, each as large as the Scout or larger, boiled out of dimensional tears, and they moved with terrible purpose, ignoring the outer planets and heading straight for Earth with single-minded hunger. Humanity's fleet met them at Mars, and 300 warships representing the largest armada Earth had ever assembled opened fire with every weapon, and the battle lit up the night sky, visible from Earth as a new star blazing red above them. "They are dying to buy us time," General Hayes reported from command, and his voice was strained, "but there are too many, and the swarm will reach Earth orbit in 6 hours. Then we use those 6 hours," Jake said, and turned to Lyria and Ashkir, "and it is time." 3 of them had one advantage the swarm did not know about, and the ability to strike at coordination. Nodes and the larger entities that directed the lesser ones, and if they could sever enough connections, they might create chaos in enemy ranks. Ashkir spread his wings, now glowing with stored energy, and Jake and Lyria mounted the dragon's back, and their powers already weaving together, and they launched from the station, accelerating past the fleet lines and directly into the heart of the approaching swarm for Earth. Jake shouted, and his voice carried across every military frequency, and for every world they have destroyed, and for every species they have silenced, and today the swarm learns that the universe fights back behind them. Earth's resonance project activated, and billions of human minds, united in desperate hope, created a probability wave that rippled outward through space, and it touched the fleet, and suddenly impossible shots found their marks, and it touched the swarm, and entities that should have been unkillable began to falter. And at the center, riding a dragon into the darkness, 2 souls burned bright enough to challenge the void itself. Jake and Lyria tore through swarm coordination nodes with ruthless efficiency, and each one they destroyed sent dozens of lesser entities into confusion, and Ashkir fought with accumulated rage of watching countless worlds fall in his roars, tearing holes in dimensional barriers. But the swarm was endless, and for every node they destroyed, 10 more appeared, and Jake lost count of the kills and lost track of time, and everything became a blur of combat and power and desperate survival. The second day the lunar defense stations fell, and the swarm breached Earth's atmosphere over the Pacific, and ground forces engaged them in brutal combat, and the Resonance Project kept probability skewed in humanity's favor, but people were collapsing from psychic strain. "We cannot keep this up," General Hayes reported, and his voice carried weight of impossible decisions. "In the fleet is down to 30 ships, and ground forces are overwhelmed, and we just detected something massive entering the system." Jake and Lyria, battered and exhausted, turned to face this new threat, and Ashkir was barely flying now, with wings torn from close encounters, but still he flew what emerged, dwarfed everything else, and it was horror beyond description, and a constant concentration of the swarm's collective consciousness. and the hive. Mind made manifest, you have fought well, little species, it said, and its voice echoed in every mind on earth. And you have made the swarm bleed in something none have done in 10,000 cycles, and for this you have earned quick death and surrender, now counteroffer. Jake replied, and his voice amplified by the Resonance Project, and you leave now and we let you survive. Entity's laughter was like stars dying, and they had been challenged, and now Earth would pay the price. The massive swarm entity loomed before them, and it was 10 times larger than anything they had faced. And Jake could feel its malevolence pressing against his mind like physical weight, and Lyria gripped his hand tighter, and Ashker growled deep. In his chest, this entity is the key, Lyria whispered through their mental link, and destroy it, and the swarm loses cohesion. But Jake, it is too powerful even for you, as Jake looked at the dragon beneath them, and at Earth's hanging vulnerable behind them. And at Lyria's exhausted but determined face, and he thought about billions of people fighting with everything they had, and he thought about Amy Bennett working herself to collapse, and he thought about humanity's impossible history of survival, Ashker. He said quietly, and how much power can you channel? The dragon's laugh was weak, but genuine more. Then you can survive, young one, and more than any of us can survive, then let us make it count. Jake said. Lyria's eyes went wide as she understood. No, Jake. The merger nearly destroyed us before, and if we add Ashkir's power to that, we might not be able to separate again. We will become something entirely new, Jake agreed, and something that might not come apart. But look at Earth, Lyria, and look at what they are fighting for, and family, and love, and hope, and stupid little dreams about quiet futures, and that is worth protecting, and that is worth any. Priest Ishker rumbled agreement. The boy speaks wisdom, and I have lived for eons and seen civilizations rise and fall, and Earth deserves better than to be one more empty system, and if this old dragon can buy them a future, then it is a good death. Lyria looked between them, and tears streaming down her face. And then she smiled, fierce and proud, and heartbroken together then, and one last time they joined hands, human and elf and dragon, and let the barriers between them collapse completely, and the merger before had been just Jake and Lyria, but this was something far greater, and Ashkir's ancient strength and his knowledge of reality at its deepest levels flowed into them, and Lyria's power, refined over countless lifetimes, became the conduit, and Jake's humanity in that stubborn refusal to accept the impossible became the catalyst. Emerged was neither human nor elf nor dragon, and it was a being of pure purpose and a concentration of will powerful enough to rewrite.
Local space time.
And it looked at the swarm's hive entity and spoke with a voice that resonated across dimensions. Made a mistake coming here, and you thought Earth was just another helpless world, but you did not understand. And we are the ones who survive the unsurvivable, and we are the species that turns impossible odds into victory, and we are not alone. The merged entity reached out, and suddenly it was not just Jake and Lyria and Ashkir anymore in the resonance. Project had created a connection, and billions of human minds willingly added their strength, and they could not fully join, but their hope and determination and desperate love for their world poured into the entity, making it something unprecedented for the first time in its existence. The swarm's hive mind felt real fear. The battle that followed existed outside normal space-time, and it was fought across probability streams and dimensional barriers, and in spaces between quantum states and the entity. That was once Jake and Lyria and Ashkir and a portion of Earth's consciousness fought the concentrated malevolence of the void. Swarm, and slowly, impossibly, it began to win. The hive entity tried to flee and to retreat back into dimensional rifts, but the merged entity was there. First in sealing pathways and cutting off escape routes, and then it did something the swarm had never imagined possible, and it followed the hive mind's connection back to the swarm's home dimension. What it found there was horrifying and sad in equal measure. And the swarm had not always been monsters, and once eons ago, they had been peaceful explorers and filled with joy and wonder, and then they encountered something in the deep dark between dimensions, and an infection of pure entropy that twisted them into what they became. And the swarm was not evil but sick and driven by corruption. The Merged entity made its final choice, and it could not cure the swarm because the infection had spread too far, but it could do something else with the last of its strength. The entity severed the swarm's connection to normal space entirely, and it pushed them back into their home dimension and sealed every gateway and burning its own essence into dimensional barriers as an eternal lock, and the swarm would survive, but trapped and unable to threaten the wider universe again as the entities. Power faded, it began to separate, and the billions of human minds returned to their bodies. Forever changed by touching something greater, and the core trinity tried to separate. Back into Threon, Jake felt panic rising, but Lyria's presence soothed him, and Ashkir's ancient calm anchored them, and they existed in a strange space neither fully merged nor separati. "I'm sorry, Jake," thought to the others, and "I should have listened, and now we are stuck like this. We are exactly where we need to be." Ashkir interrupted, and boy and girl, an ancient dragon were just roles we played, but we were always meant for this, and to become something new, and to be proof that different beings can merge into something greater. He's right, Lyria added, and her presence warmed despite everything. And Jake, I have lived so many lives, always searching and always fighting alone, but this being part of something larger and connected forever to you and Ashkir is the first time I have felt complete. So what happens now? Jake asked. The universe itself seemed to respond in acknowledging what they had become, and the merged entity felt reality shift around it. And they were being offered a choice, and they could force themselves apart and return to individual forms, though diminished and damaged, or they could accept this new existence and becoming something unprecedented. Die vote for staying together? Jake said, and being boring can wait. Lyria's laugh echoed through their shared consciousness, always so human. Even now, let us be something new, Ashkir agreed, and let us be proof that cooperation creates strength greater than conquest. It's so. They chose to remain merged in becoming a being that would be known as the Triad and protector of Earth and guardian of the weak and living symbol of what different species could become. When they fought as one, they descended to Earth as a new being and humanoid, but marked with draconic features and elven grace, and their form shifting between states as needed. And when they touched down at New Haven Station, the crowds fell silent. Timmy Bennett stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. Jake and Lyria and Ashkir, all three, the Triad, responded, in its voice a harmony of their original tones, and also, "None and we are what we needed to become to protect this world, and we are the promise that different species can unite. And we are proof that humanity's time among the stars has begun." General Hayes cleared his throat. "So, what do we call you now, and how does this work with military rank?" The Triad laughed, and for a moment it was pure Jake Morrison from Portland. "How about we figure that out over coffee? And I am told I still drink too much in orbit." The last swarm entities flickered and died, and their connections severed, and Earth's battered fleet began recovery operations, and around the world people who had been part of the Resonance Project woke from exhaustion, forever bearing a small connection to something greater. The war was over, and Earth had survived, and in doing so proved the universe was bigger and stranger and more wonderful than anyone imagined. In years that followed, the Triad became Earth's champion in exploring the cosmos and finding other species threatened by darkness, and teaching them that unity was strength and diversity was power, and where once an alien princess had pointed at a confused human, now stood a being transcending all three. And somewhere in that merged consciousness, Jake Morrison smiled. Because even though he never got that quiet retirement and never lived that simple life, and he gained something infinitely more valuable in purpose and connection and knowledge, that sometimes the best versions of ourselves are the ones we become. When we stop fighting, alone the Void Swarm was defeated, and Earth learned that humanity's greatest strength was not weapons or resilience, but their ability to reach out and to connect, and to turn strangers into allies, and allies into something greater. The universe would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be.